August 22nd, 2026, 2:14 local time. The Taiwan Strait, approximately 43 nautical miles northwest of the port of Taichung, on Taiwan's western coast, and 71 nautical miles southeast of the Chinese port of Guangzhou in Fujian province. The strait at this point is 180 kilometers wide. The water depth ranges between 60 and 90 meters across the central channel. Shallow by ocean standards, deep enough to hide things. There is no commercial traffic. The strait, which in normal times carries more shipping tonnage per square kilometer than almost any other waterway on Earth, has been empty of civilian vessels since August 19th, 3 days ago, when the People's Republic of China declared a maritime exclusion zone covering the entire Taiwan Strait and the waters within 200 nautical miles of Taiwan's coastline, citing what Beijing's official statement called necessary military precautions during a period of grave national security concern. The exclusion zone declaration had followed 72 hours of the most intense PLA military activity in the strait since 1996. Ballistic missile tests over Taiwan's northern and southern tips. PLAAF fighter incursions across the median line at a rate of 40 to 60 aircraft per day. Planned surface combatants holding station in formation patterns that US Pacific Fleet analysts had identified with high confidence as pre-positioned blocking forces for a potential amphibious approach corridor. No shots had been fired. No formal declaration of hostilities had been made. The situation existed in the precise political and military limbo that Chinese strategic doctrine refers to as below the threshold of war. A sustained, escalating pressure campaign designed to coerce political concessions without triggering the formal alliance mechanisms that would bring US military force into direct confrontation with the PLA. The USS Freedom variant littoral combat ship operating in these waters tonight is not here to fight. It is here to evacuate. Welcome. I'm your host at Navy Legends. Tonight, we are examining a scenario that sits at the intersection of two of the most underappreciated realities in modern naval warfare: the lethality of naval mines in shallow, constrained waterways, and the specific operational vulnerabilities of the littoral combat ship class when operating in exactly the environment it was designed for. This is a fictional simulation, built from documented PLA mining doctrine, real LCS engineering specifications, and the operational logic of what a Taiwan Strait evacuation mission would actually look like under the conditions of August 2026. Every system named here is real. Every tactical problem described has a documented origin. Let's begin. The LCS had been assigned its mission 31 hours earlier at a National Security Council emergency session that had authorized a limited, non-combatant evacuation operation, NEO, for US citizens and designated third country nationals at 4 locations on Taiwan's western coast. The NEO was politically sensitive in ways that went beyond normal operational security. The administration had concluded that authorizing a full carrier strike group to enter the strait under current conditions would be read by Beijing as a commitment to defend Taiwan militarily. A commitment that Washington was not, at that moment, prepared to make explicitly. The LCS was chosen specifically because it was not a carrier. It was not a destroyer. It was a smaller ship, more lightly armed, faster, theoretically optimized for shallow coastal waters, that could conduct the evacuation mission with a lower political profile. That logic was sound in the conference room. It was about to be tested in the strait. The LCS was operating without surface escort. 2 P-8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft were assigned to provide overhead anti-submarine warfare coverage, operating on alternating 4-hour station orbits from Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. An E-2D Hawkeye was providing airborne early warning coverage from a holding pattern 180 miles to the east over open Pacific water. A Virginia-class fast-attack submarine was positioned 60 nautical miles to the northeast, assigned to provide subsurface area awareness, but under strict orders not to approach within 30 nautical miles of the Chinese coast without explicit authorization from Pacific Fleet Command. The LCS had left Taichung Harbor at 1:22, having completed embarkation of 247 evacuees, US citizens, embassy staff from 3 allied nations, and 12 Taiwanese nationals with US permanent residency. The ship was heading northwest on a pre-planned departure corridor that had been selected by the operations staff for its relatively deep water, 75 to 85 meters across most of the route, and its distance from the known PLA surface combatant positions, which satellite imagery had placed at 55 to 90 nautical miles to the north and south. What the operations staff did not know, what no US intelligence asset had detected in time, was that the PLA Navy's Mine Warfare Force had been active in the Taiwan Strait since August 17th. 5 days. 5 days of nighttime mine-laying operations conducted by a combination of surface mine layers operating under cover of darkness inside the exclusion zone, and 2 Type 039A UN-class submarines that had been pre-positioned in the strait since late July, carrying EM-57 bottom-influence mines in their torpedo tubes, and deploying them systematically across a grid that PLA mine warfare planners had calculated would intercept any western coast evacuation corridor that US operational planning would consider viable. The EM-57 is a bottom-lying influence mine. It rests on the seabed and detonates in response to the combined acoustic, magnetic, and pressure signature of a passing vessel. It has a programmable target discrimination system that allows it to be set for specific vessel types. In this case, set to discriminate against large commercial vessels and fishing boats, but respond to the acoustic signature profile of US Navy surface combatants, which the PLA's hydrographic research program had documented extensively over years of close tracking operations. The EM-57 can be set for a ship counter. A specified number of vessels must pass over it before it activates, allowing the mine layer to let friendly or neutral traffic pass while the weapon waits for its designated target. The LCS passed over the first EM-57 at 2:14:07. The mine registered the ship's acoustic, magnetic, and pressure signature against its discrimination parameters. It was a match. The ship counter was set to 1. The mine fired. The EM-57 detonation sequence uses an upward-directed shaped charge that projects a high-velocity jet of water, a Monroe effect water jet, upward against the passing vessel's keel. The warhead weight is 320 kilograms of RDX-based explosive. At a depth of 78 meters, with the ship's keel at 4.8 meters draft above the mine, the water jet had 73.2 meters to travel before impact. It traveled that distance in 0.047 seconds. The jet struck the LCS's keel at frame 34, directly beneath the main machinery space. The hull of the Freedom variant LCS at the keel line is constructed of high-strength steel with a thickness of 12 millimeters, sufficient for the sea conditions the ship was designed to operate in, substantially less than the armored keel protection of a destroyer or cruiser. The water jet penetrated the keel and opened a breach approximately 0.8 square meters in area. Flooding began at a rate the ship's damage control team would later estimate at 1,400 liters per minute. The explosion also destroyed the port main reduction gear assembly and severed the port shaft. The ship lost port propulsion instantaneously. The starboard shaft sustained vibration damage from the pressure pulse. The asymmetric flooding created an immediate 6-degree port list that placed the starboard propeller partially out of its optimal operational arc. Within 40 seconds of the detonation, the ship's maximum achievable speed on the starboard shaft had dropped to 8 knots. On the bridge, the watch team had gone from quiet transit to damage control emergency in the span of 1 explosion and 1 second of silence before every alarm on the ship activated simultaneously. All stop. Sound general quarters. This is not a drill. All hands to damage control stations. Flooding in the main machinery space. The commanding officer was on the bridge in 44 seconds. She had 247 civilian evacuees aboard, a flooding hull, 1 functioning shaft, and a position in the middle of a maritime exclusion zone that the PLA had declared it would enforce. She made her first call to 7th Fleet at 2:15:31, 1 minute and 24 seconds after the mine detonation. What she did not know at 2:15:31, what the ship's sonar team would not determine for another 4 minutes, was that the mine was not alone. The PLA mine warfare plan for the Western Coast Evacuation Corridor had placed mines in a staggered pattern, not a continuous minefield, which would be detectable by systematic sweeping, but a sparse, randomized pattern with variable spacing between 800 meters and 2,400 meters. designed to create maximum uncertainty for a vessel attempting to navigate through or around it. The ship had detonated the first mine in the pattern. It was now dead in the water, or nearly so, at 8 knots on a damaged shaft, in the middle of a field that contained an unknown number of additional weapons. Moving faster risked detonating another mine on the starboard side, which at this point would almost certainly be fatal to the ship. Moving slowly meant remaining in the field longer, potentially drifting over another mine on the damaged port side. Stopping entirely was the worst option. A stationary vessel with an active hull breach and 1,400 liters per minute of flooding was a sinking ship. The commanding officer had 3 options, and none of them were good. At 2:17:44, the first P-8A Poseidon arrived overhead at 15,000 feet and immediately began deploying sonobuoys in a pattern around the ship's position. The Poseidon's AN/APS-154 Advanced Airborne Sensor, a synthetic aperture radar with maritime surveillance capability, began imaging the sea surface and the upper water column, looking for the acoustic signature of mine influence fields. The P-8A cannot detect bottom-lying mines directly. The APS-154 can detect moored mines at shallow depth and can sometimes identify recently laid bottom mines from the disturbance pattern in the seafloor sediment if conditions are good. In the Taiwan Strait in August, with tidal currents running at 1.2 knots and bottom sediment disturbed by 5 days of mine-laying activity, conditions were not good. At 2:19:03, the P-8A crew reported to the LCS. They could not clear a specific safe corridor. They could identify 2 areas of probable mine presence based on sediment disturbance imagery, one to the ship's immediate northwest, one to the southeast. But the data was not precise enough to define a safe heading. The commanding officer made her decision at 2:19:41. She would hold course, northeast, toward open water, at 6 knots on the starboard shaft, accepting the risk of further mine contact, rather than maneuvering in an unknown field without reliable mine location data. She ordered the damage control teams to their maximum effort on the flooding compartment and directed the ship's surgeon to prepare the medical spaces for potential casualties. She also directed the ship's embarked MH-60 helicopter, a single Sierra variant, which the LCS carried as its primary organic air asset, to begin transferring evacuees to the P-8A's emergency contact point. The MH-60 could carry 12 passengers per lift. At 247 evacuees, achieving full transfer before the ship's situation became untenable would require 21 lifts. At 18 minutes per round trip to the P-8A's overwatch position and back, that was 6 hours and 18 minutes of continuous helicopter operations. The ship had, in the damage control team's worst-case assessment, 3 hours of reserve buoyancy before flooding overcame the pumping capacity. The math was not survivable without additional assets. The second call to 7th Fleet at 2:21 was not a status update. It was a request for emergency assets, specifically a request for the Virginia-class submarine to be authorized to move to a closer position to provide sonar mine detection coverage from below, and a request for an MH-60 helicopter detachment from the nearest available surface combatant to support the evacuation transfer. Pacific Fleet Command received the request at 2:21:14. The Virginia-class authorization was approved at 2:23. The submarine was directed to close to 15 nautical miles, a position from which its TB-29A towed array could image the minefield from a safe distance and potentially provide corridor data. The second, MH-60 authorization required identifying an available surface combatant. The nearest US surface combatant in position to respond was a destroyer operating 140 nautical miles to the northeast. At 30 knots, the destroyer was 4 hours and 40 minutes away from the ship's position. Its organic MH-60 Romeo could launch immediately and reach the LCS in approximately 52 minutes. The MH-60 Romeo launched from the destroyer at 2:24:37. It would arrive at 3:16. Meanwhile, the LCS was moving at 6 knots through a minefield it could not see. With a flooding hull, 247 civilians aboard, 1 functioning shaft, and 3 hours of reserve buoyancy. At 2:31:09, the Virginia-class submarine reached its authorized position 15 nautical miles northeast and began streaming its towed array. The sonar picture that emerged over the next 22 minutes was partial, but valuable. The submarine's passive sensors identified 3 areas of bottom disturbance consistent with recently laid influence mines. One 1,100 meters ahead of the LCS on its current heading, one 800 meters to the ship's port side, and one 2,200 meters to the southwest, already behind the ship. The contact ahead was the most urgent. At 6 knots, the LCS was 11 minutes away from the estimated position of the third mine. The submarine transmitted the mine position data to the PLA, which relayed it to the LCS at 2:53:14. The data gave the commanding officer something she had not had until this moment, a specific hazard to avoid. She ordered a 12-degree course change to starboard. Not a dramatic maneuver, but enough to put 600 additional meters of lateral clearance between the ship's track and the estimated mine position. The maneuver brought the ship 340 meters closer to the port side mine contact. She accepted that trade-off. The port side mine was assessed as 800 meters away, inside the submarine's detection uncertainty envelope, which at that range in those conditions was plus or minus 200 meters. The course change gave her best geometry on the ahead contact. She was gambling that the port side mine was at the outer edge of its uncertainty envelope rather than the inner. At 2:58:44, the LCS passed over the estimated position of the third mine. Nothing happened. Either the mine was not there, a false contact from the submarine's sonar, or the course change had placed the ship outside its detonation trigger radius. The uncertainty envelope would never be resolved. What matters is that the ship passed over the position at 2:58:44 and continued. By 3:16, when the second MH-60 Romeo arrived from the destroyer, the ship's medical team and the MH-60 Sierra had completed 6 evacuation lifts, transferring 72 of the most vulnerable evacuees to the P-8A's contact point, from which a US Air Force C-17 on emergency diversion from Kadena was collecting them for transport to Okinawa. The arrival of the second helicopter doubled the evacuation rate. By 4:22, the LCS had cleared the estimated boundary of the minefield. The Virginia-class submarine's towed array showed no further bottom disturbance contacts on the ship's projected track. The commanding officer did not reduce speed. She kept 6 knots until the ship was 18 nautical miles clear of the last contact. At 4:41, the flooding in the main machinery space had been partially controlled. Damage control teams had shored a temporary patch over the primary breach and reduced ingress to approximately 380 liters per minute, within the capacity of the electric submersible pumps on the emergency circuit. The ship's list had been corrected to 2 degrees with counter-flooding. The situation was stabilized, not resolved. The last evacuee was transferred to the MH-60 Romeo at 6:03. The ship, carrying only its crew, turned northeast on its remaining shaft toward the destroyer that had provided the helicopter, which was now closing to provide direct escort to Guam for emergency dry dock. 247 evacuees, all alive, all out. The ship survived. The mission was accomplished. In the classified after-action assessment filed by Pacific Fleet Command at 1400 on August 22nd, the engagement analysis focused on 3 specific failures that had contributed to the LCS entering the minefield without warning. The first failure was intelligence. The PLA mine-laying operation had begun 5 days before the NEO was authorized and 3 days before US intelligence had assessed an elevated mine threat in the strait. The 72-hour intelligence lag, attributed to the loss of a key signals collection satellite to a Chinese ASAT demonstration in early August, and the reduced overhead coverage that resulted, had left the mission planning without current mine threat data. The second failure was platform selection. The LCS's draft of 4.8 meters placed its keel at precisely the depth bracket for which the IM-57's influence parameters were optimized. A destroyer, with its deeper draft and more robust keel construction, would have received a harder hit from the same mine. But a destroyer's damage control capacity, flooding tolerance, and redundant propulsion architecture would have given it substantially better odds of absorbing that hit and continuing the mission. The LCS had been chosen for its lower political profile. Its lower survivability had not been weighted equally in the decision. The third failure was mine countermeasures. The US Navy's dedicated mine countermeasure capability, The Avenger-class mine countermeasure ships, aging but functional, had not been positioned anywhere in the Western Pacific theater. The nearest MCM asset was in Bahrain. Reconstituting an MCM capability in the Pacific in the 31 hours between the NEO authorization and execution was not achievable. The PLA mine warfare program has received significantly less Western analytical attention than the DF-21D, the J-20, or the Type 055 cruiser. It should not. China's mine inventory is estimated at between 50,000 and 100,000 weapons of multiple types. Bottom influence mines, moored contact mines, rising mines, mobile mines. The EM-57 is one variant among dozens. The mine warfare doctrine that employed it in the Strait was not improvised. It was the product of 30 years of systematic study of U.S. naval operations in contested shallow water environments. Mines are the oldest naval weapon still in active use. They have sunk or seriously damaged more U.S. Navy ships since 1950 than all other threats combined. More than aircraft, more than torpedoes, more than cruise missiles. They cost between $10,000 and $100,000 each. They require no operator once laid. They do not distinguish between a warship in combat and a ship carrying 247 civilians on a humanitarian mission. The LCS commanding officer made extraordinary decisions under extreme pressure with incomplete information and came out on the other side with her crew and her passengers intact. That is not luck. That is training, discipline, and command judgment, under conditions that most naval officers will never face. But the minefield was still there when the ship cleared it. Every mine that did not detonate was still on the bottom of the Taiwan Strait, waiting for the next ship. This is what Navy Legends returns to, in scenario after scenario, in theater after theater. The weapons that we underestimate are the weapons that define the engagements we did not plan for. A bottom influence mine on the floor of the Taiwan Strait is not a dramatic weapon. It makes no radar return. It gives no warning. It produces no exhaust plume for an infrared sensor to chase. It simply waits, with complete patience, for the acoustic and magnetic profile of the ship that was always its intended target. That patience is what makes it one of the most dangerous things in the ocean. Stay informed. Stay vigilant. I'll see you in the next one.